Hey guys, Rob here, and today you join me for episode 26 of How It Was Made. Now this is the very first Pagani Zonda C12 ever made, and this is what I'm going to replicate. So I'm starting with this Peako Pagani Zonda Monza, which is the racing version of the C12. This has the correct headlights and tail lights required for this build. So as with all custom models, it starts with disassembly. So the model is broken down with all the parts removed. I never throw anything out, so I'll be keeping these parts that are not needed for some other builds. Just a mock-up with the similar style wheels, and I've got some other Zonda parts from some previous builds. Now this is a Motor Max Zonda C12 die-cast model, and I'm going to be using some parts off it. Primarily these A-pillar side mirrors, some little bits and pieces from the exterior and also the interior to jazz up the interior. I'll of course keep the engine for another build that I have planned. So back onto the body. So first step, I traced the shape of the side skirts, continued some disassembly on the rear of the model, and also I filed off these little carbon gurney flaps, as they are only on the race car and not the street car. So they were just simply filed away, and then I moved on to the front hood, where I filed away the V shape, as the C12 has a flat hood, and I also reshaped the center leg underneath the hood as well. Next step was to fill in these Fender Louvers. So I just used some Tamiya putty here to fill up the louver shapes. Also did some more work on the interior, a little bit of grinding with the Dremel, and this blue part is actually from the Motor Max Zonda. So this has some incorporated speaker mounts on there, so just sort of glued that on and then molded it in with some more Tamiya putty. Now back on, I always protect the carbon parts that I don't want to redo, and just a bit more sanding there. Now this front lip has an extension that comes out too far, so that was sanded off, and then a radius edge was sanded onto it to match the real car. Now the side skirts are too deep on this Monza, and they don't match the new front splitter, so the idea here was to trim 3mm off the height, which you can see here. I cut the whole sill off, and then I will actually add a new 3mm thick sill that matches the front splitter. This will be made out of some plastic sheet, but I'm just using some 3mm MDF here as some spacing. Back onto the interior, a bit more filling and sanding and a bit of primer. You have to repeat this step a few times because without primer it's hard to see the little gaps that you need to fill. And these are just sort of working out what I need to do with some of the interior pieces as well. The Monza has a racing dashboard, whereas the Zonda C12 has the street dashboard, so I'm going to modify that as well. More applications of putty on the holes and the front louvers, and some more sanding. Always lots of filling and sanding to do on these models, so I just have to keep going backwards and forwards doing that. Filled in the rear vents for the first time, and some more putty was added in there also. Again, lots of sanding, lots of filling, lots of sanding again. The joys of building a custom model. Now on the rear deck lid here, there's actually a hole there with a grill, so I filled that original slot in there, and these little underspats have to be modified too. They're quite different on the Monza, so I'm going to trim some off the depth of them. And here also I have to cut out these solid quarter windows, which aren't windows in the Monza. They have fuel fillers, so I pulled out the fuel fillers and I actually cut out the bodywork to be able to mount some windows in there. Now I give the body a quick coat of grey primer just to see and check the progress of my bodywork. This usually brings up any faults or extra little areas that need some filling, so this is a crucial step as you go. A little bit more tidying up to do here on the rear quarter windows, just with a file and a hobby knife, but we're getting there and getting similar to the shape that I require. Now these are the original side skirts. I trace those onto some 3mm styrene sheet, cut them out and add some primer on there. So this will be the new side sills, which will later be wrapped in carbon fibre decal but they now match the front splitter, so it's easier to make that as a separate piece. This is the rear deck lid, which has a 10mm hole which was just drilled out using a normal drill bit, and I also added a little hole for a fuel filler. Continuing on with the back, more filling, more sanding, you guys get the idea. And with the nose, I actually have to thicken it up a little bit. So you can see I've got some pencil erasers wedged in there to glue some 3mm plastic sheet in there to make the nose thickness thicker. Again, some primer on there to see where else I have to fill, and I kept doing that on the side skirts as well, so if I saw a little bit of a gap, I filled it. Now this is my little grill that I need to make for the rear deck lid. So I came up with an idea to drill a hole and press some mesh into the hole using a metal punch. Didn't quite work the first time, it sort of had buckled edges on the top, so I cut another piece of mesh out in a sun shape and then pressed it into the hole. This came out much better, and with a little bit more finessing when it's time to glue it in, I'll get it a lot flatter. Here you can see the nose with the extra pieces added in there, and then also some putty added in the bottom to narrow up the air vents in the front to match the real car, and some putty added on the under spats here to change the shape of those as well. So it's tedious work sometimes, but you just have to keep applying it, filling, sanding, priming. Now this was trying to work out the location of the A-pillar mirrors, so just using pictures on the internet, I sort of scale it and get a rough shape, drill some holes in the A-pillar, and these will be good to go. Now this is the reshaped spats on the rear, so again, Tamiya putty was used, and this is a sanding block I made for the front putty area. So rather than sanding this by hand, I just make a block out of some MDF, glue some sandpaper to it, and then I can get a consistent angle that I need to sand on the front, as you can see here. So this gives that slight little quirk at the bottom. I decided to add some more filler on the top of the fenders. I wasn't happy with how high they were, so I was just trying to finesse the original Peako model a little bit and just make it look a little bit more realistic. Just again, more filling in the center air vents, and just thought I'd have a bit of a look and just sat the windows in there and some wheels underneath just to get an idea to see whether I'm on track or not with the shape. So I'm pretty happy with the way it's coming along so far. Again, I need to start marking out the driving lights in the front bumper bar. So this idea I came up, I drilled a hole into the putty and I used some styrene hollow rod and I glued that into the holes. I then used the X-Acto knife to trim them off close to flush, but yeah, back onto the back of the car, a little bit more sanding, and some more sanding on the front fenders. Sorry the pictures jump backwards and forwards, I tackle different things on different days. And a little bit more filler in the front to close up the gaps between the styrene and the original resin body, but we're getting there with the front shape. Now with the back, I masked up the carbon area around the tail lights because I didn't want to have to redo that. And it's just pretty much going back and forward over the front of the model. I decided to redo the driving light locations because I wanted the tubing to stick out a little bit, as you can see here, like the real car. Onto the back of the model, the Monza actually has an air jack hole and another little hole in between the tail lights, so I had a couple of goes and filled those with filler. Now to make the custom rear wing, I'm using the stock wing blade that came on the Monza. I cut it down in width and also in length to match the Zonda C12 street car. I then marked out a center and some cut lines on the side, and I filed these down in the front but finished flush in the back. I then used some 0.5mm styrene sheet, heated up with a gas lighter to create a permanent bend in those side pieces. These were then glued onto the sides of the wing blade to match how the stock wing is, and this is the basis for the rear wing. So I basically sand the sides to the similar shape. looking at pictures on the internet to try and get the angles right, and then added a little bit more glue in the back and let that dry for a couple of days. I then added some 2-part Tamiya putty to build up the underside to blend it all into one shape. A little bit more filling, a little bit more sanding. You guys get the drill. This is what you have to do with custom models. And this is the underside. So you can see how I've blended the original wing blade into those thin plastic pieces that I added on the end. So this forms the shape of the C12 wing, and a bit of primer on there. You can see a couple of little dints there that need to be filled. The grey primer is great for that. It's just Tamiya spray can grey surfacer, and it sands off quite easily when it's time to paint the model properly. But I'm nearly there with the bodywork, so just repeated steps over and over again, and I decided it was a good time to actually glue the mirrors onto the A-pillar. Before I paint the model, I'm just using some masking tape there to make some templates for the carbon fibre front splitter. I then primed the body and all the parts in some white 2K primer, sanded that down, and then sprayed the body using a silver metallic base coat. This needs a couple of coats of clear over the top, which I did, and now I'll come back and do some carbon fibre work. So I'm going to redo the carbon on the sides around the tail light surrounds, which I've done there. I'm leaving the center section, that's the Peako carbon, and I've added some carbon fibre on the front splitter and on the side sills. Now this is Hobby Design carbon fibre decal, and that works a treat. Now I wasn't quite happy with the finish on the clear, so I rubbed it down with some 3M superfine sanding sponge, and then I re-cleared the whole body, including the carbon fibre areas, so that all the carbon fibre decals are underneath the clear coat now. So reasonably happy with how that came out, and added quite a bit of gloss onto the carbon side sills. Now the dashboard, I made this resin cast piece off another dashboard. I'm going to dissect it up, cut the old racing parts off the Monza, and then graft on these resin parts onto the Monza dash. So this will create the street dash required for the C12 street car. A little bit of reassembly here, rear side meshes going in. I actually used some micro scale crystal clear into those spotlights, as it looks white now, but it will actually dry crystal clear and look like a lens. And I used some headlight lenses there from Legend Miniatures in France. Side skirts glued onto the body. Really happy with how those came out. So back onto the dashboard. This is all going to be painted except the front section, which stays carbon. Re-glued the rear tail lights in, and this is my metal piece I made, glued back in, and also a chrome fuel cap I used off the Motormax Zonda C12. I'm also going to use this rear dress ring for the exhaust outlets, as the Monza one was wrong. So this is the chrome piece off the Motormax model. This is also the exhaust muffler out of the Motormax model. I just cut that up with the Dremel and used just some little parts in there to look like the chrome mufflers in behind the mesh pieces. So that came out quite well. I reused the exhaust pipes from the Monza. I just cut them down a little bit shorter in length and then coloured in the black rivets. So added a little number plate light and a black Zonda number plate. Now the interior door trims are copies I made from a Zonda Cinque. I wrapped the outside in some carbon fibre decal. I couldn't find some Tamiya paints that were the right colour, so I mixed up my own colours, and here I just added some centre fins back into the bumper bar. Interior turret pieces painted in the light sand colour, and then all the other pieces painted as well. So it's got a combination of a chocolate brown sort of colour and a tan colour. Fitted some of the accessories back, and pretty happy with how that came out using just parts out of the parts box. So all of these parts that I painted in Tamiya paints, I clear coated them with Tamiya flat clear as well. glued in the roof window and the back window as well as the front window. I'm using micro scale crystal clear glue for windows now, much better than super glues, and seems to be quite strong as well. Now I needed to make some custom windows for the sides and the quarters. The Monza windows had race window sliders in them, so I used some clear acetate sheet, masked an internal edge to leave a black border, sprayed that with black paint, pulled the masking off, and you have a clear acetate window with a black border. These were then glued into the body and let dry. Now these are my new wheels, just sitting under the car. They were printed for me by MIYminimodels.com. I'll put a link in the description. And I also made this little carbon fibre gurney flap at the back out of some styrene sheet and wrapped it in Hobby Design carbon fibre decal. Now no one makes photo etched emblems for models, so I just used some decals for the logos. Glued in the brakes behind the wheels, and finally my flocking arrived so I could finish the interior. So I just added some tan flocking. I did a couple of coats to cover some of the markings on the floor pan, and then I glued all the parts back together again, so seat belts, seats, and it came together quite well. Dashboard glued back into the model, interior tub and rear panel glued on, and the front windscreen wiper and wiper cover was glued back on. I then glued it back onto the original base that the Monza was screwed to. Pretty happy with that Peako base to use that. And that's a lot of work, but pretty happy with how the end result came out. So this is the finished model of my Zonda C12 car number 001. Yeah, overall pretty happy with the result. There was a lot more effort involved than I thought to convert the Monza back to this C12, but it's definitely a car I wanted in my Pagani collection. So now I've got the full 20-year history of all the Zondas. So yeah, really happy. I hope you enjoyed this build series and you can appreciate how much work goes into these custom models. I've got plenty more videos coming before the end of the year and another few how it was built videos. But yeah, overall, as I said, really happy with how this one came out, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of how it was made. So don't forget to subscribe if you like the video, smash that like button, and don't forget to check out my merch too. So until next time, thanks for watching Rob's Model Cars.